All right, hello everyone, and welcome back. I'm Tanisha Parrish, and I'll be your moderator for this panel where we're going to focus on education, inequality, and the future of learning. And I'm joined by three of our panelists today with very, very diverse backgrounds. First, I'd like to introduce Bree Dusseault, who's our practitioner in residence at the Center of Reinventing Public Education. And then we have Helena Merk, who's the CEO and co-founder of Glimpse, whose networking platform you just had a chance to experience. And then lastly, we have Tonya Drake, who's the Regional Vice President, Northwest, and Chancellor at Western Governors University, Washington. So thank you three for being here. And I'm Tanisha Parrish. I'm the Director of Learning and Development at Better Up and also an executive coach. So first, just a reminder to the audience, please submit your questions in the chat throughout the talk. We can't see you, but we definitely want to hear from you. Okay, so I'm going to start by sharing a couple stats, and I'd love to get some initial reactions to it. So a new study, the National Student Clearinghouse, shows the number of first-year students dropped 16% at U.S. colleges and universities because of the coronavirus pandemic. It's also down nearly 23% at community colleges. And the largest drop was amongst Black students as well as American Indians, which we know are communities that are already disproportionately impacted by COVID. So the reasons for not enrolling range from financial strain to travel concerns to not wanting a remote classroom experience, and really the fears that some of these students may not actually return or pursue a higher education in the future. So I would love to get initial reactions to that, starting with Tonya, since you work at a university. What are you experiencing in terms of enrollment related to the inequality gap?
Well, thank you so much, Tanisha. First, let me thank you for inviting me to be on this wonderful panel. I'm excited to have the conversation. I think the statistics and information is disheartening and unfortunately not unexpected. I think as we've seen the impacts of this pandemic, both emotionally, physically, and financially, it's really taking its toll on all industries, higher education included. And we also know from the pandemic that people of color are disproportionately being impacted, and higher education is no different. I think some lessons learned that we have from the Great Recession, which seems like a lifetime ago, but really I think there's some great lessons to learn, and that is individuals delayed going back to higher education by up to 2 years, which extended our ability to help individuals upskill and reskill and get back into the market. And we're seeing those same trends again with this pandemic as we move from understanding this as a short-term pandemic to much more of a long-term impact across the globe. And so I would say that's not surprising, but something that we definitely need to act upon.
Yeah, when you think about action, and Bree, curious to get your perspective on both reactions and action. What can we do, right? What steps can we start to take to address an already wide inequality gap that's just getting wider under COVID?
Thanks so much, Tanisha, and it's great to be here with everyone. Almost all of my experience is in the K-12 system, so I'd love to start with my reaction through the lens of K-12. And while I am a researcher right now at the University of Washington Center on Reinventing Public Education, I've spent the last 20 years more on the ground as a executive director, area superintendent, principal, and teacher. So that really is where most of my heart and identity is. But I am researching literally every day how districts are responding across the country to COVID, as well as states, and I'm talking to people all over the country about it. So have a lot of thoughts on it. You know, I think the big reaction I would add on to what Tonya said, which I completely agree with, and I think we're seeing is that from the K-12 perspective, to layer onto that, we're seeing a disproportionate number of students in the high school, especially upper high school grade levels, absent or dropping out of school with greater likelihood already in this year. And we're seeing from surveys of youth across the country that students of color and students with less access to resources are choosing to or needing to either stay home to help their family, to take on extra jobs, but to do other things, to put other things first before they can value their education. And that is an incredible challenge that we're all living right now. So just to name that it's at the college level, but I think we're already seeing that this will be rippling through for years to come in just the first month of school this year. So in terms of what to do, I was hoping to maybe end on some of these thoughts, but I'm going to go ahead and put them out there right now. I have a lot of thoughts. I think we all do. It's probably why we're here. When I was thinking about what are some of the moves that I assume we'll get into kind of these kind of inequities and the root system of inequities in our systems. And I think one big root system that can be uprooted is just who we have in our schools and who is making decisions, who is driving change. And the more that we can get the students who we want to serve most and place at the center of our systems in leadership roles, everything from classroom up to superintendent, the better. And so one of the things that I would love to see us doing with a lot more intentionality is starting to structure talent pipelines and recruitment efforts of current sitting high school students to prepare them to enter the education system, and especially students who are represent different types of diversity that we want to see more representative. We know right now that across our country, our teacher force, our leadership force are far more white than the students that we teach and that we serve, and really just don't represent the diversity of our students on a lot of different fronts. And so the more that we can be targeting those students, there are some great work. Gwinnett County is an example of a district that has a program where you can start taking classes as a high schooler to learn about teaching. And then there are programs to become a teacher in the system, and they really laud and accelerate that work. There are some charter management organizations that do that have scholarships and stipends for their students when they're in college to come back and work in those systems. So I think the more we can be doing to prepare the next generation of leaders is a start, one of many, many things that needs to change.
I absolutely love that. And we will balance and spend a little bit of time digging into root cause, but the coach in me really wants to propel us forward, because so much of education and trying to really solve not only inequality, but quality of education can sometimes feel very daunting. So it's a big systemic problem that can take a lot of time to solve. So I am curious, before we move forward and start to think about the future, what is critical for us to understand about why there is such a huge inequality gap? And we'll primarily talk about the US lens, but why have we not made very much progress on closing the gap? And if anyone wants to jump in first, I'll let you guys opt in here.
I was going to let Helena speak just because she hasn't spoken. I'm happy to jump in on that. That's a fantastic question, but let me pause.
I mean, if you have a great answer, go for it. I need to think a bit more.
Okay, go for it, Tonya.
So I will say that's an incredibly complex question, and certainly one that we're not going to solve here. Because it's systems, right? And so systems of oppression are designed to do that very well, which means we have to dismantle systems, and there are groups and entities that benefit from that and those that are oppressed by it. And I think it will take a collective impact model to really help us dismantle those systems and to reestablish different policies, objectives, and even skill sets in order to move us forward to decrease inequities and increase opportunities. I think at WGU we talk about, talent is abundant, but opportunity is not. And it is our role to work with one another to increase those opportunities for all.
I love that. Thank you, Tonya. What about you, Bree?
Yeah, I love that too, Tonya. And I agree that we will not get to the root of it. And Tanisha, I love your forward-looking focus. I think what I'd add is just, it kind of builds off what I was saying before, that the education system, and I heard this on the last panel as we were coming on, but the education system was built. It was built in a flawed way. It was built with really different kind of interpretations of what learning and what our citizenship and what our society looked like. And so we've just been tinkering with and playing with this model that's kind of like, to start with, is built around kind of, as Tonya said, an oppressive, through an oppressive frame. I don't think that was, the intention. Maybe it was, but it's certainly the output. I do think that getting, your people are your greatest resource. I love your point about there's so much talent and it's about freeing up opportunities. Really agree with that. And I think that within the system, the more that you can help bring in folks who are willing to do the deep reflective work, the adaptive work, the like of humble leadership that it takes to drive change and to be bold and to be risk takers, to dismantle systems is important. I would also add that from a solutions perspective, some of what I think can help dismantle inequity is just heightening transparency and accountability. So just being clearer about what happens behind closed doors and how decisions are made and what data is there that is valid data to look at, can also help the general public understand better what is even there to be grappling with.
Great. And Helena, I see you came off mute. You want to jump
Yeah,
in?
I was just gonna add, I love those answers. But in terms of like what I think has like prevented, equality from, reaching with the rise in technology, we still have this inequality. And I think in terms of addressing a lot of that, we should focus on increasing access to internet and making that equitable, because you'll see a lot of increasing opportunity coming from online learning, whether it's Coursera, Udemy, and other classes one can take. But those are then limited to people who have access to that. And those are a lot easier to scale and deploy to people outside of traditional education structure. And like you have both mentioned, the education structure that we have now is outdated. And I think if we think outside of that current structure, we can reach kind of the end goal of, more opportunities, more education, a lot faster.
Great.
I think Helena really said a lot in there, and I'm hopeful we get to unpack that a little bit, because digital equity is a contributor as we go into this pandemic. I think digital equity has really revealed a lot about who has privilege to even, jump onto their Zoom course or has access to not only K-12 but higher education. And I think we've seen several reports that have come out that people of color, particularly the report identified Black and Latinx, but I would throw in their Native American populations as well. And I identify as First Nations, so I threw my community in there as well. But they're lagging 10 years behind their digital access, and that's just not acceptable.
Yeah, and I would add, if you peel back the layers of the onion, there are all these layers of access where some families may have some version of broadband, but it's not actually the capacity or the speed needed or the bandwidth needed to be able to access digital learning. And I would say that what we're seeing on the ground, and I think those of us who have kids in school or who may still be in school are living, is that it takes so much more than just a device and a broadband connection. A lot of districts are finding that even supplying those tools, there's a digital literacy work, there are often language barriers, there's just the ease of the system. Some systems, children can have 10 to 15 different platforms and logins, and a lot of technical issues. And I would actually argue that part of bridging the digital divide from an equity standpoint is continuing to offer in-person access for all students, in the way that many students who have privilege are forming pods or hubs, as we learned about, and that until students can go to an in-person learning center, if you're, for example, a student experiencing homelessness, you may not have access to a charger to plug in your computer. You may not have access to a place to go where someone can help support you in the way that a student with privilege might through a pod or hub. So I think districts are being asked to really push in on this definition in the K-12 system of what digital equity means in this moment, to really make it accessible to all.
Yeah, I mean, there's, like you said, there's so much to unpack and peel back the layers. Given this new COVID educational environment that we're in, I'm curious, how are you all seeing trends, or what are the trends you're seeing with people taking different educational paths? So traditional school, charter, homeschool, et cetera. Very curious to see from the different perspectives what you're seeing. And Helena, I know you have personally taken a unique approach, so I'd love for you to share your story.
Yeah, I'll start with my story and then kind of talk about what I've seen my peers do. So about 2 years ago, so long before the pandemic, I chose to leave college and work on startups. Glimpse came out of that about a year later, but it wasn't kind of the intention going out. It was more recognizing that school had a lot of structure, and my way of learning was more loving to dive deep into a problem set and like go into rabbit holes of things I loved learning about. And that always worked for me. And I started working in a startup. That worked great, took a full-time opportunity, and then eventually left that to start my own company. And that flexibility is what I was looking for, but it doesn't fit everyone's needs. And the pandemic made a lot of other people question the structure of school. So there's this flip side of, people recognizing that like, wow, this academic system is outdated. This isn't for me. I can learn these same things, by being hands-on somewhere else, whether that's, now you can't be as hands-on because you have to be remote, but point being, getting immersed in some activity rather than learning it in a classroom setting, turns out it works well for a lot of people. And they've been shoveled into academia because that is, the status quo. But on the flip side, you've seen people who, can't now attend online education and are forced to do other things. So I've had peers who, take semesters off to go internet startups, and then others who are at home supporting their families. And it's interesting to see kind of how people are able to couple whatever activity they're doing now with education, whether that is through some form of like, online education while also working full time, because now we somehow have more time in the day than before. But people are full-time students and then they're working full time, which is not great for burnout, not great for mental health. And couple that with a global pandemic, and you have people going nuts all over the place. And part of what we do is try to figure out how do we build social relationships online, because that's what's missing from all this online education. It is, it's purely content driven. You're watching a lecture or you're watching a professor who's doing their best to adjust to these circumstances, but it's nowhere near the same of, sitting in a classroom and then walking out and geeking out about how cool that chemistry talk was. You're missing all of those little micro interactions that end up making the college experience great, in addition to, all the outside of classroom stuff. But that is what we've seen people miss the most. And in general, I'd say overall, people are taking gap years, gap semesters with the intention of going back. Of course, everyone says they have the intention of going back. Even pre-COVID, my intention was, semester off, I'll go back. So we'll see what happens. I think it's a bit early to tell. But at the end of the day, people are missing it so much that they do want to go back.
Right. Just a quick question from the audience. So Helena, is that part of the reason you built Glimpse, to help with those micro interactions?
Funny enough, it's not. We, when we first started working together, myself and my co-founder, I also pulled him out of Duke. We really wanted to build more authentic, genuine relationships. And this looked like, if anyone's heard of Lunch Club AI, the networking platform, but it was basically this platform that helped you meet offline one-on-one. We believe that a lot of the social platforms like the Facebooks and Twitters of the world have ruined people's mental health and their ability to have these strong, authentic interactions. And we're hoping to build, the very antithesis of that. How do we authentically bring people together and address both the mental health crisis and loneliness at one of its root causes, which is just authentic interactions. And by building this, we spent several months, how do we get people offline? And then maybe like 2 weeks before the pandemic, we finally realized that there were many reasons that our hypotheses were flawed in terms of, why, or like, I guess what it took to get people offline. So we shut that down and we started working in video platforms. And then when the pandemic hit, we were kind of perfectly aligned And our platform has been taking off since then. So I think our timing has been really great in order to like, I mean, imagine being an offline platform now, but also like being able to support people in this time, whether it's connecting, you know, the UPenn freshman class when they're doing orientation, or business school students at Leeds, and all these different use cases that now exist only because of the virus.
Right. And just to kind of continue the thread of, I'd like to bring together the piece of a digital divide and inequality, and also kind of this future investment in ed tech, right? So education, there are a lot of education startups that are getting funding in the market. So curious about perspectives on what role the private sector plays in shaping education and addressing the inequality in education.
I think that's a great question, and very important for us to address. I'll talk about two things that come to mind. When we're hearing from a lot of employers that they have a hard time differentiating skills that are learned either through formal like certificates, degrees, versus skills gained through experience, like Helena's experience. And so at WG, we're starting to work with partners in industry, such as IBM and the National Student Clearinghouse. I like that you brought that into the conversation, as well as other larger employers, to really develop a skills sort of wallet, if you will, that individuals can put their earned credentials from formal education, but also skills learned from experience. Whether that be the startups like Helena's creating, or maybe it's military experience. We all gain skills in different ways, but so that we can begin to articulate what it is that we bring to the workforce. In doing so, we also need to know what else we need to learn, because industries change, and they're changing at a very fast pace. And so individuals who may have had teaching credentials that they earned even 5 or 10 years ago are finding that they need to upskill, particularly with online learning. And those skill sets, they don't need to go back for an entire new degree. They just need some skill sets to help them evolve their learning processes in an online platform. And so we're seeing opportunities to work with industry to meet their needs, as well as students who are seeking employment. And then the other area that I will say is there's some really big business that is coming to the table and really putting some significant money to help address the digital equity. I had a great conversation with T-Mobile. You may have seen some of their ads around their commitment to providing $10 million to K-12 students who don't have access. So they're providing hotspots and access to individuals who might not otherwise have it over the next 5 years. And that is a great example of how industry is coming to the table to help address the digital equity, but they need K-12 partners, they need higher ed partners, they need other folks to also come help them navigate that. But those are two that come to mind.
Wonderful. Go ahead, Bree.
Sure. I feel like one, I just want to name that I think Helena's modeling how business and kind of learning can partner, in that you took the plunge to start your own startup, and you are now serving the field. And there are a bunch of middle schoolers that I would love to get onto Glimpse because they all want to make friends with each other. And that is such a great example of, it's the little moments, the little micro interactions that are so important developmentally and socially for kids. So I just want to thank you for that. And I think that's a great example. I think, where my brain goes, and it's probably similar to what Tanya's saying, I think there's kind of like systemic, and then there's individual ways that the private sector can help. And I should mention that I actually started in the private sector. My training's actually in economics, and I was a consultant for a couple of years, but my heart was actually in my volunteer work, which was in schools. And so I shifted professions, but I really do believe in the value and hold the value of both sectors. And I see a lot of siloing that naturally happens. And then you see these breakthroughs like Tanya's describing, where partnerships happen and they can be so fruitful. So I think that from a partnership angle, what I would advise is, so much turns on relationships and so much turns on exposure to what's really needed. And so if if from a systems perspective, the more that partners, kind of like for-profit or even nonprofit partners, can help partner with the community that they want to serve and not feel like they have to drive the agenda, but actually be partner to and learn from, and actually kind of advance and accelerate what is needed there, and to understand that oftentimes product solutions need to be relatively differentiated for different types of student need and family need, and just the humility that comes with that type of partnership work. I think it's just really important for both making a product that is truly accessible to all and understanding the nuances, as well as so kind of like getting the best end product, but also just to work with respect for the customer in this case. And one example that Tonya gave, as long as we stay in this pandemic, as long as we are thinking about preparing for future crises or pandemics, something that is absolutely happening and happened this spring is that what we learned was that schools and districts are community centers. They are not just learning centers. And they were asked, districts especially, to do everything. They are meant to be learning institutions, but what they really were in the spring was meal delivery systems, broadband technology delivery systems, service coordination systems, and all of that is fine. But when we also rely on them to ensure the learning of our next generation of children, it's really asking a lot of them. And so I think the more that businesses can either work with, put pressure on government officials, or problem solve larger systemic solutions so that school systems can go back into what they were designed to do, albeit I would argue like there's improvements that need to be made in the design, but you just saw a lot of districts feeling really strapped and not delivering on education because they were delivering on other fronts. The last thing I'd say, just at an individual level, for all of the individuals on this call, what I would add is that I think if you are trying to work in this space, coming at it from a lens of proximity, that the more proximal to the communities that you want to be serving, the better informed you can be. And there's actually a responsibility to be proximal. If you want to serve and support a community, you really need to understand it. And that proximity can look like board membership. It can look like volunteering on the ground. It can look like working to live in the communities that you want to serve. There's a lot of ways to be proximal, but I would really encourage that so that you don't have distancing of what folks with good intentions think are solutions with what folks who are being served with some of those solutions, or hopefully partnering in those, where they may have differences of opinion.
Great, thank you. All right, I know we're getting close to time. I would like to take a few questions from the audience. So first we have a comment. Bree, almost sounds like you're describing my student impact model. So that's wonderful. And then one question. So this is specific to teaching and earnings of teachers. So the lack of diversity of K through 12 teachers relates directly to opportunity costs. If you're a first generation student, teaching doesn't provide a sufficient return on the college investment. How can we increase earnings in teaching to recruit these students? I'm going to pick on.
That's all you, Bree.
I'm going to pick on you, Bree, since you touched on it.
Yeah, I'm totally happy to. I feel like I'm chatting a lot, but I completely agree. I would actually say it starts with making sure that the pathway to becoming a certificated teacher is accessible through funding as well. So helping secure funding for the university programs, for the internships. A lot of times when you're doing an internship, you need to take part-time salary. So even just getting to the door of becoming a teacher is really restrictive. And then, to tackle the question of salary for teachers, which I would say, having done a lot of roles, teaching was by far the most demanding, challenging. You can just do it you can never stop. It's an obsessive job. I think it gets into, it's actually kind of a deeper conversation about how we fund our schools, how taxes are levied. And there's a lot of inequity in that system too, how we use property taxes. how we have variation in income taxes and even just the percent. I'll just say a quote from an uncle of mine who said, I pay more for my cable bill than I do for my public education system. And I don't know if that's truly accurate, but it often gets at where the base of challenge is, which is that the states only have so much to work with to distribute.
Go ahead, Tonya.
The only thing I would add is a personal anecdote. I have a middle schooler and a high schooler, and they're both doing online education. And so I think many of us who are in that position have gotten a small glimpse of what teachers do. And I have the utmost respect and will be a strong advocate for anything that comes through to help increase their pay, because it is very well deserved. And they are meeting the social and emotional needs of not only the children, but the families also. I agree with Bree that they become the lifeline of our community. So while I don't have an answer to it, I do want to be a strong advocate for it.
Wonderful. All right, with our last question, I actually, so thank you, Jennifer, in the audience. She actually teed it up very nicely. I'd love to go around to the three of you and encourage the audience to put your ideas in the chat as well. So the question is, if we're to focus on one area, or if you were to pick one area to close the inequality gap, what would it be? I'll start with you, Helena.
Equal access to internet and tech, I think, is gonna go a long way. Because even if nothing else, you can get access to educators around the world. So that's self-explanatory with tech. Yeah.
Tonya.
I have to agree with Helena. She's a wise woman. I think digital equity is really where we need to put a lot of time and attention, because with that, I think we begin to bridge that digital divide, not only for our rural communities who need that last mile in order to get internet, but for our urban communities who simply can't afford access to internet or even the equipment for it. And so I think by bridging that digital divide is one way that we can all come to the table to decrease the inequities that we're seeing across education.
Bree.
And I would third that. I would go so far as to say that I think that internet connectivity has a strong case to be made to be a public good at this point, and to be seen as something required to be that everyone has the right to. And I mentioned, the pipeline work and really working to accelerate diversity in the education profession. I would just second that as well. And I think if I were trying to do it beyond just like building for the next generation, just really working to incentivize and remove the barriers that exist for why we don't have more diversity among our educating in our education field. I would love to, and I think that some of those barriers that I would work on are funding for getting into programs, and transparency of hiring in districts. I would add that as well.
I'll throw in one thought. I've been discussing this with my husband, so I absolutely agree with the universal internet. I've also been thinking about universal housing of some sort for everyone. I feel like there are basic needs that need to be met first, that can enable individuals to show up differently in an education environment. But if we can start to remove some of those, again, systemic problems, whether it's homelessness or food insecurity, you can start to really move the needle on attendance, engagement within the classroom. All right, well, I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you to our panelists. Really appreciate your engagement. Definitely an extremely complex problem, but I love and appreciate that you all are committed to it in your own individual ways. So look forward to seeing what you do individually and collectively.